The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of burning wood and damp soil as I walked along the familiar dirt path leading to my grandfather's cabin. It had been years since I last visited this quiet village, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. My world had become a whirlwind of work, noise, and endless responsibilities, a blur of nameless faces and fleeting connections. But this place was different. Here, amidst the winding paths and open fields, I felt closer to my roots, to my family, and most importantly, to my grandfather. As I rounded the final bend, his cottage came into view, a modest wooden house surrounded by a garden that had grown untamed in his absence. His health had been fragile lately, and my mother insisted someone needed to check on him and stay for a while. Though she intended to go herself, life had swept her up in its tide of obligations, leaving me to volunteer, secretly grateful for the chance to escape. I knocked, though I knew he'd insist I come right in. Sure enough, his gruff but welcoming voice called from within. "Ah, Lena, there you are, my girl." When I stepped inside, I noticed he looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still sparkled with the stubborn resilience I had always admired. He pulled me into a warm hug, his scent a mix of tobacco and pine. Despite his years, he remained tall and strong, his voice steady and deep. "You're still as lovely as ever," he said, stepping back to study me with a broad smile. "City life hasn't made you too fancy, has it?" We both laughed as I shrugged off my coat and he led me to the living room. The fire in the stone hearth crackled warmly, casting the room in a soft orange glow that seemed to echo the autumn hues outside. Settling into an armchair, I accepted the cup of tea he brought over, setting it down with the care he reserved for few things. "You've been taking care of yourself, haven't you?" he asked, pouring the tea and handing me a cup. The lines on his face softened as he looked at me with genuine concern. "Yes, Grandpa. Busy, but I'm doing well," I replied, taking a sip. The warmth of the tea spread through me, soothing the restless part of me that had been wound tight in city life. "I missed this place," I admitted. "I missed you." He chuckled, settling into his chair. "Well, it's good to have you back, even if the circumstances aren't ideal. I don't get many visitors these days, not since your grandmother passed." I glanced around the room at the framed photographs on the walls. Moments from his youth, faded pictures of my grandmother, and snapshots of my mother and aunts. His life, his history, was woven into the fabric of this house. "It must get lonely," I said softly, feeling a pang of sadness for the solitude that had defined his days. He sighed, his eyes growing distant for a moment. "You get used to it in a way. But seeing you here, hearing your voice, it brings life back to this place. Reminds me of when you were just a little girl asking me 100 questions about everything." I smiled, recalling the summers I had spent here as a child. Back then, he had been the towering figure in my life, my storyteller and guide. His tales of the village, of the past, of friends and adventures had enchanted me and shaped who I was. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking as though no time had passed. As dusk settled over the village, he lit the old oil lamps around the room, their soft glow creating a cozy ambiance. Just as he had when I was a child, he began telling stories. Stories that seemed richer, deeper, and more intimate with the passage of years. He spoke of his life with my grandmother, of his youth, and of the difficult decisions he'd made along the way. That night, I stayed in the guest room, but sleep eluded me. The familiar sounds of the house, the creaking floorboards, the groan of the wood as it settled, stirred long dormant memories. I thought about the ease of our conversation, so different from the superficial interactions I had grown used to in my own life. The next morning, over breakfast, he looked at me with a tenderness that made me feel like his only grandchild. "Stay a bit longer, Lena," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Just a few more days. You bring life into this house." His openness took me by surprise. "Of course I'll stay as long as you need," I replied, moved by his words. The days that followed settled into a peaceful routine. We took morning walks along forest paths, tended to the overgrown garden, and prepared meals together. I noticed how he lingered nearby, watching me with a quiet intensity. It wasn't intrusive, it felt grounding. It was as if I were seeing a reflection of what my life could have been. Simple, steady, and full of unspoken love. One evening, after dinner, I sat beside him on the couch, our shoulders brushing. He looked at me, his expression softening with something I couldn't name, something ancient and profound. "Thank you for coming, Lena. You remind me of your grandmother," he said, his voice low and reverent. "I don't know if I'm much like her, but I'll take that as a compliment," I replied with a smile. He reached out, placing his hand over mine. His fingers, though rough, were warm and gentle. We stayed like that for a moment, our breaths sinking, an unspoken bond filling the room. As the weeks went by, I cherished each moment, realizing I had found something I didn't know I was missing. The connection, the sense of belonging, the feeling of being rooted. It all became part of me. The house, the village, and the gentle rhythm of life outside the chaos of the city drew me in as naturally as the seasons changed. Eventually, I knew I'd have to return to the city. But as I left, I carried with me a piece of my grandfather's love, his unwavering presence. That bond, stronger than time or distance, lived on in our shared memories, our silences, and the love enriched by the years between us. Our days together passed in a quiet rhythm, each one weaving us closer in a way I couldn't fully explain. The village felt like it belonged to us alone, the world shrinking to just the two of us in that cozy cottage. As the chill crept in, the cold outside only seemed to emphasize the warmth we shared within. Each morning, we moved through the rituals we had created. Breakfast, a walk through the frost-laden woods, and conversations that unearthed memories as precious as hidden treasures. My grandfather had always been a quiet enigma to me, a man of reserved words and understated dignity. But now he was sharing parts of himself I'd never glimpsed before. One evening, we sat together on the porch after dinner, wrapped in blankets, our breaths visible in the crisp night air. The stars above shone brighter here than they ever did in the city, their light giving the world an otherworldly glow. He turned to me, his eyes soft and a gentle smile playing on his lips. "You've brought life back into this house, Lena," he said, his voice barely audible. I met his gaze, warmth blooming in my chest. "I feel the same," I admitted. "It's so peaceful here, being with you." He reached out, his hand covering mine as he had done so many times before. But this time his touch lingered, his thumb tracing small circles over my knuckles. We sat like that, cocooned in a silence that needed no words. His presence anchored me, quieting something restless within. One afternoon, he suggested we go through the old family photo albums together. Sitting side by side on the floor, we spent hours flipping through pages of faded memories. For each photo, he had a story to tell. There was one of him as a boy in the village, another of his first car, and one of my grandmother on their wedding day. When he spoke of her, his voice softened and his eyes took on a faraway look, full of a love that had only deepened with time. For the first time, I saw him not just as my grandfather, but as a man who had truly lived, who had loved deeply and completely. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I felt his hand rest lightly on my shoulder, a comforting weight as familiar as my own heartbeat. I leaned into him, letting the closeness fill the room with an unspoken connection. We weren't just sharing memories, we were creating something new, something sacred that was ours alone. That night, as I prepared for bed, there was a soft knock at my door. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" he asked, his voice tentative. "Of course," I replied, sitting up as he stepped inside. He hesitated, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking almost shy. I motioned for him to sit beside me, and he lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. His eyes met mine, warm and kind, but with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "You know, I never thought I'd feel this again, Lena," he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "This sense of closeness, of home." He reached for my hand, and I held his, feeling his fingers curl around mine with gentle strength. "I feel the same way," I whispered, my voice catching. "Being here with you, it feels like coming home." I didn't realize how much I'd been missing it. He smiled, a soft, almost wistful expression. And for a moment, we simply looked at each other, letting the silence speak. The bond between us, strengthened over these weeks, felt deeper than anything I could describe. I rested my head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of belonging, a connection that went beyond words. It was a warmth that filled every corner of my heart. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment, and for a while, we simply stayed like that. Two souls finding solace in each other's presence. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a blanket, yet beneath it was a restlessness I couldn't name. I tossed and turned, the quiet amplifying my thoughts. Every creak of the old wooden floor, every distant groan of the cottage as it settled into the cool night, reminded me of how close I had come to feeling completely at peace here. And yet, something still felt incomplete. Finally, after hours of chasing sleep in vain, I gave in to the pull that wouldn't let me rest. Slipping out of bed, I padded softly down the hall. His door was slightly ajar, the warm glow of his bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but the pull was too strong. I knocked softly, the sound barely audible. "Come in," his voice called, low and gentle. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside, my heart fluttering. He was sitting up in bed, an old book resting in his hands, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. When he looked up and saw me, a soft smile spread across his face, the kind that always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his tone tender. I nodded, stepping further into the room. "I kept thinking about our talk earlier," I admitted, "and I didn't want to be alone right now." He set the book aside and patted the space beside him on the bed. "Come sit with me." Crossing the room, I climbed onto the bed and folded my legs beneath me, leaning against the headboard. There was something so natural, so easy about being there with him. He reached over, placing a hand on my shoulder, and a warmth spread through me, filling a hollow I hadn't realized was there. "Sometimes," he began softly, his eyes distant. "When your grandmother was still here, we'd sit up late like this, talking until the sun came up." He chuckled, the sound tinged with bittersweet memories. "Those quiet late-night moments made us feel closest." I smiled, leaning into his touch. "I think I understand what you mean," I murmured. Meeting his gaze, I felt an unspoken understanding pass between us, a shared vulnerability that needed no words. He sighed, his gentle expression piercing through to my heart. "Lena, I may not be around forever, but I'm so grateful for these moments we've had together. You've given me something I thought I'd lost. A second chance to feel alive again." His words stirred something raw and honest within me, and I found myself reaching out to place my hand over his. He glanced down at our intertwined fingers, his thumb brushing over mine. The room seemed to hum with a quiet intensity, comforting yet unsettling. After a moment, he gently tugged my hand, pulling me closer. I leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder as he wrapped an arm around me. The steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek, the warmth of his embrace. It was all so familiar, so safe. "You mean so much to me, Grandpa," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "More than you probably realize." He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, his breath warm against my hair. "And you, Lena," he replied. "You've brought joy back into my life, a joy I thought was gone forever." We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, the night stretching on in a comfortable silence. For the first time, I felt a calm settle over me, a peace that seemed almost sacred. It was as though we had found something timeless and true, something that would stay with us always, even long after this night had passed.